All right, so tonight we're going to continue on with the Black Death of the Golden Gate. This will be chapter 11. I got to admit, this one hits a little close to home, so bear with me for a little bit. But yeah, tonight it's chapter 11. The title of chapter 11 is As Soon as Possible. A short article in the San Francisco Chronicle in April of 1902 made Rupert Blue's pain public. Its headline alone, Dr. Blue's wife secures divorce, was enough to cause a minor scandal in his hometown of Marion, where the voluntary termination of marriage was still rare. In her complaint, Juliet said that Rupert had failed to materially provide for her, adding another layer to his humiliation. Rupert had not seen Juliet since he left her family home in Washington, and soon learned that she was preparing to sail to Europe for the summer, no doubt intending to immerse herself in the high society and possibly of romance after the drudgery of life with him in the Marine Hospital Service. Rupert, now officially alone, remained in Milwaukee, where he braved a future that he had never imagined. His entire life he had measured himself by the example set by his older brother Victor, and never before had he found himself falling so far behind. Victor was a war hero, and married with 2 young children, all but completing the circle of expectations set out by the social codes of the South. Rupert was none of that, and now his shortcomings were laid bare for all to see. He retreated into his work, grasping on to the one link that remained between his vision of what life would be and how it was actually turning out. On his better days, he forced himself to accept invitations to dances and cocktail parties thrown by members of Milwaukee's upper crust, if for no other reason than to keep his social skills from atrophying from disuse. On other days, he spent more and more time in the boxing ring, hoping his fists could do what his brain had not, and pummel his problems away. He had stood in the ring with his gloves on, delivering and receiving blows he felt as if his body was exercising the shame of the last 2 years of failure. The spread of plague in San Francisco was never far from his mind, yet he had no energy to return to the city and allow another defeat to enter his life. With Blue no longer there to open doors and smooth over disagreements, federal doctors felt their influence in the city weaken. City, state, and federal health officers were in open conflict with one another, leaving a coordinated response impossible. Under guidance from Governor Gage, state health inspectors began refusing invitations to attend the autopsies of suspected plague victims, and would then claim that federal doctors were conducting them in secret and lying about the results. All attempts to force state health officials to acknowledge the reality of the plague were blocked, ignored, or disregarded. One state doctor, when reached by telephone at his office by Marine hospital officers informing him of the planned autopsy of a victim, pretended to be one of his clerks and said that his supervisor was away on business. Federal doctors grew so suspicious that one official wrote to Wyman and asked if the Secret Service could investigate whether state health authorities were working with the Chinese 6 companies to secretly dispose of the bodies of Chinese plague victims. I regret to suspect Dr. Stone of such rascality, but I believe that he is perfectly suitable for such work, he complained. Doctors on the city's health board, meanwhile, were more focused on politics than fighting the disease. Eugene Schmidt, a 37-year-old violinist whose flowing black beard and good looks prompted the press to call him Handsome Gene, had launched a campaign as a third-party candidate for mayor. Behind his unlikely entry into the race stood Abe Roof, a lawyer who had once studied classical languages at Berkeley before rising to the head of the upstart Union Labor Party. Together, Schmidt and Roof ran on a racist platform that promised to purge the city of its Chinese population and increase the power of labor unions. The message resonated with the white working class of San Francisco following a year of citywide strikes in which the outgoing mayor, James Phelan, provided police protection to workers who crossed picket lines. Schmidt soon edged out his better-funded challengers. Though he had no governing experience, the new mayor leaned heavily on Roof, who was widely considered the true mayor of the city. Together, they began installing the most corrupt administration yet seen in the city, requiring bribes and kickbacks at nearly every level of government. Schmidt diverted attention by rekindling anger at the plague campaign. In his inaugural address in In his inaugural address in January of 1902, the mayor singled out the city's Board of Health as one of the evils threatening the livelihood of working men in San Francisco, and promised to hold its members responsible for foisting upon the world sensational and ill-founded reports about the existence of bubonic plague in our midst. 2 months later, he announced that he was removing 4 members of the board, including its lone bacteriologist, and maintained that he was unalterably convinced that plague had never existed in the city at all. When a judge ruled that Schmidt did not have the power to fire board members until their terms expired at the end of the year, the mayor retaliated by slashing its funding so far that it could do little more than issue death certificates. His lone appointment to the board, a physician who also happened to be a significant campaign contributor, never showed up for meetings and instead spent a year traveling through Europe on the city's payroll, ostensibly to study the spread of infectious diseases there. With all the sanitary campaigns in the city suspended, there was nothing to prevent plague from spreading at will. The arrival of warm spring weather brought a new surge of cases. On May 25th, the body of Chin Ki, a 20-year-old bill collector who worked at the Horn Hong newspaper company, was found at his home at 811 Jackson Street. Tissue samples collected by federal doctors from his bubo in his armpit tested positive for plague. 4 days later, Hong Kwai, Chin's 4-year-old nephew, died while being hidden from federal doctors in a coffin shop at 742 Pacific Street. Animals inoculated with tissue from the young boy's body soon died from plague, confirming the disease. 4 more bodies infected with plague were found in July, including 2 on the same block of Jackson Street, bringing the total number of cases confirmed by federal doctors since the start of the outbreak to 61. The bodies of another 9 victims were found in August, straining the ability of the bare-bones federal staff in the Chinatown morgue to keep up. Mark White, the doctor who had taken over from Blue, wired Wyman in Washington asking for extra $25 per month in his budget to spend on the supplies necessary to confirm each case of the disease. Wyman denied the request, hoping that the upswing would go away on its own. The pace of death only quickened. On September 9th, Chen Mong Young Shi, a 33-year-old woman, died in a small apartment at 40 Fish Alley after suffering from a high fever. An autopsy by federal doctors revealed a bubo on the right side of her neck. Interviews with men living in the alley revealed that 2 days earlier, a 17-year-old boy who lived with Chen Mong had also run a high fever, prompting his relatives to remove him from the apartment to avoid detection. He was taken across the bay to Oakland, where he died 3 days later. No federal doctors were on hand to examine his body, and no official cause of death was recorded. Federal doctors only knew of the case and the other 20 deaths from plague that had been confirmed so far that year due to Wang Chung. Driven by his sense of purpose, the interpreter remained on the Marine Hospital Service payroll despite Blue's decision to transfer back to Milwaukee. He was among the few in San Francisco comfortable moving between the parallel worlds of Chinatown and the larger city, and felt it his duty to save Chinese lives, even if that meant inviting white doctors whose motives might not always be aligned with his own. Still, the job took its toll. He walked through the narrow alleyways of Chinatown, probing for word of more victims. Wong struggled to keep at bay the inherent tensions in his life. By exposing the disease, he was increasing the likelihood that doctors would eventually find a way to end the epidemic. Yet he could not forget the fact that as a Chinese man, he shared in the risk that each new victim he uncovered could be the one that finally prompted politicians to make good on their threats and burn the district to the ground. Though his identity pulled him in two directions, Wong knew that he was all that stood between plague and its future victims, and he was unwilling to allow the disease to kill in silence. His work made him a marked man within his community. Not only was he working with untrusted white doctors, he served as a walking reminder that outsiders considered the district unfit for Chinese occupation, and the Chinese an unwelcome part of American life. In 1902, to the cheers of white labor unions, President Theodore Roosevelt signed a bill that permanently banned Chinese immigration into the country. Those who were already in America were required to obtain a certificate of residency, and any Chinese immigrant found without the required papers was subject to immediate deportation. With no legal path for arrivals into the district, San Francisco's business elite renewed its calls to relocate Chinatown from its central location. The Chinese question is settled now. The labor elements have had their way, and Congress has renewed the Exclusion Act. There is no longer any use in keeping Chinatown as a sort of red herring to tail under the noses of visiting congressmen, and frighten them into voting to ban the Chinese immigration, wrote the influential San Francisco newsletter, after more than 150 businessmen signed a petition calling on the mayor to resettle the Chinese in another part of the city. The Chinese now have one of the best parts of town, and they have forfeited their right to it by their habits of life. In the face of rising bigotry, the Chinese turned even more insular, seeking safety by having as few contacts with white San Francisco as possible. We can save ourselves if we realize that we are all in the same boat and will sink or sail together, argued the Chinese Western Daily in an editorial. Ruin will await if we behave like fish that swim blindly into the boiling pot. Chinese tongs openly patrolled the streets of the district, threatening anyone whose actions brought unnecessary outside attention. With his work with the federal plague doctors well known in Chinatown, Wong's friends urged him to stop feeding information to the Marine Hospital Service if he valued his own safety. He refused their pleas and continued to alert the men at the Chinatown morgue to the location of potential victims. Wong did not remain safe for long. In early October, he received an invitation to attend a special meeting of the Chinese Six Companies, its exact purpose unspecified. He arrived at the organization's headquarters and entered the building just after sundown. As he sat listening to the proceedings, unsure of his purpose there, several gangsters rose from their seats and lunged at him. He fought off the attackers and ran for the door, not knowing who else in the room considered him an enemy. Only after the president of the Chinese Six Companies, for whom he had once worked as a secretary, took him under his arm did Wong believe that he would escape the building with his own life. He watched as the men who had tried to kill him fled, confirming his suspicions that the only thing uniting the Chinese tongs and the white men in power was their willingness to do anything to suppress the truth of plague in the district. The attempt on Wong's life prompted Secretary of State John M. Hay to warn the Chinese foreign minister in Washington that any attack on Chinese residents working for the federal government would be met by a decisive response. Undaunted by the attempt on his life, Wong continued his search for victims. He soon alerted federal doctors to the plague-infested body of Hu Hing Bong, a 47-year-old man who lived at 743 Clay Street. He was the 18th recorded victim of the disease in a span of 2 months, though the truer number of fatalities was likely many, many times higher. All the cases were found within a block of one another in the northern half of Chinatown, suggesting that the disease was gathering strength. It was only a matter of time before it would begin spilling inward. As fall approached, federal doctors could only wonder if at last their nightmares had become real. Wyman could no longer ignore the escalation of disease, which was becoming a source of national embarrassment for the Marine Hospital Service. Federal doctors in San Francisco had battled the disease for 3 years, and yet it only seemed to tighten its grasp. He ordered Arthur Glennon, a Marine hospital surgeon then in charge of the quarantine station in Cuba, to report to California and inspect every city in the state with a significant Chinese population for the presence of plague, a group that included Fresno, Oakland, Berkeley, Stockton, San Diego, and Los Angeles. Before that, however, Wyman told Glennon to meet with Governor Gage, if for no other reason than to prevent another state challenge to his agency's federal authority. Glennon arrived in mid-October. I guess that's the bourbon a little bit. Glennon arrived in mid-October and traveled to the Los Angeles suburb of Downey, where Governor Gage lived on a sprawling citrus ranch. Though he was still nominally in charge of the state, he was effectively without power after a series of embarrassing scandals, none of them related to the plague. This led Republicans to nominate another candidate in his place in the upcoming election. Gage had retreated to the citrus groves of Southern California to wait out the final months of his term and watched with growing resentment as an Oakland physician, George Pardee, secured the nomination that he considered his right. Shunned by both Republicans and Democrats in the state, the governor welcomed the federal officer into his home and warmed to him once he offered a letter of introduction from Wyman. Yet he could not hide his anger once Glennon told him that California was once again facing a threat that Texas would quarantine all the people and goods from the state on account of the persistent rumors of bubonic plague in San Francisco. "That goddamn plague again," Gage bellowed. Not wanting to incite Gage further, Glennon said that the Surgeon General intended to address any cases found outside San Francisco as quietly as possible. The governor insisted that all of the supposed cases of plague victims were merely a form of syphilis, yet he agreed to let Glennon conduct his tour of the state without obstacle. "I'll cooperate with the Surgeon General Wyman, and with you, but damn the others," he told him. "Kenyon would have been mobbed and hanged in San Francisco if I had not prevented it. And now, I am sorry that I did." As Glennon prepared to leave, Gage promised that he would fix newspapers in the state to avoid unwanted publicity. "This is the best that can be done at present," Glennon wrote in a telegram to Washington later that afternoon. 2 weeks later, state and local health boards from across the nation gathered for an annual meeting in New Haven, Connecticut. Though it was not on the agenda, San Francisco soon became the focus. City officials continued to deny the existence of plague, while the Marine Hospital Service and national newspapers published details of the deaths of its victims. With officers from the Marine Hospital Service observing, the convention passed a resolution condemning California as a disgrace for its failure to readily share facts about an outbreak that was a matter of grave national concern. A few health officials went further, arguing for a full quarantine of the state. Though the matter did not come to a vote, implicit in it was the charge that the Marine Hospital Service was not doing enough to protect the country from plague. When confronted by health officials who lived outside California, Wyman downplayed the extent of the disease, aiming to spare the agency he considered an extension of himself from criticism. Pardee's victory in the gubernatorial race gave Wyman hope that, with a physician in the governor's office, he would have a close ally in the state, allowing the Marine Hospital Service to do its work without harassment. Until he forged a relationship with the new governor, however, the Surgeon General continued to deflect any inquiries as to the true strength of the disease in the city. The infection appears to be limited to Chinatown in San Francisco, and to be restricted within the limits of that locality to a very small area, Wyman wrote in a letter to Edmund Sochan, the president of Louisiana's State Board of Health, who was also one of the most prominent physicians in the South. "I was informed by the president of the City Board of Health, Dr. Williamson, that in his opinion, there is very little of it." Sochan had no way of knowing that federal doctors at the time were examining the body of Jiang Yen Yum, a 38-year-old man who resided at 726 Pacific Street. An autopsy revealed plague bacilli in the lungs, abdomen, and groin. The man's death made him the 40th victim of the plague that year. Far from being contained, the disease was now accelerating its pace, bringing the city closer and closer to the widespread epidemic that had devastated Hong Kong. California, meanwhile, was no nearer to admitting the scale of the danger it faced. Gage, in his final message to the state legislature, once again blamed Kenyon for sending what he called misleading reports about the disease, and cautioned the men standing before him that it was their duty to guard against any encroachment from the federal government. Wyman sensed that he could not stall much longer. In mid-January, the health boards of 11 states met to address the plague in California. The proceedings began with officials berating California's representative and shouting down his assurances that the incoming governor would implement all measures required to eradicate the disease, leaving him later to fume that he was never treated with such discourtesy in my life. State health officials then turned their focus onto Wyman himself, peppering him with questions about the extent of the disease. Wyman would only allow that there was not much plague in the city, leaving conference members pretty unimpressed. A resolution was soon passed affirming that the presence of plague in California was established beyond debate, and condemned Governor Gage and State Health Board for obstruction. Given that the disease was entrenched in the city, the conference passed a second resolution asking the Secretary of War to reallocate troops on transports to San Francisco from Seattle. If implemented, the measure would hollow out the economy of both San Francisco and the state. Its status as the most important port on the Pacific would crumble as a national rail traffic shifted north, draining the power of the railroad barons who still effectively ran California. The twin resolutions had an immediate effect. Newspapers in San Francisco called the measures silly and continued to downplay the idea that bacteriology was a valid branch of science. Instead, the city took the opportunity to congratulate itself. Thanks to the persistent effort on part of sober-minded San Franciscans who refute the baseless allegations of the men who attempt to make the world believe that it is necessary to use microscopes to discover an epidemic. This community has never for a moment been panic-stricken, as it might easily have become had the alarmist stories gone unchallenged, the Chronicle wrote in an editorial. Nor was it the city's confidence that it could continue to deny the epidemic dented when health officials in Mazatlan, Mazatlan, Mexico, blamed an outbreak of plague in that coastal city on a passenger steamship arriving from San Francisco. The Mexican government instituted a country-wide quarantine on goods and people coming from San Francisco, yet the city refused to believe it was true. Plague was somehow an infectious disease which remains absolutely non-infectious in San Francisco, but is capable, at the same time, of infecting persons down at Mazatlan, one prominent doctor joked to reporters. Wyman, however, knew that his time was up. It is absolutely necessary that confidence on part of the health officers toward California authorities should be restored, and I am convinced that this cannot be done unless the governor in some manner acknowledges the presence of plague in Chinatown, he wrote in an urgent telegram to Glennon. The situation is now entirely changed, and absolute frankness on part of authorities of state and city is necessary to prevent pronounced hostile action, particularly when the Conference of All States meets in April. He sent another telegram to Glennon a few days later suggesting that they bring back the only man who seemed to make any real progress in the fight against the disease. "Unless you wire me not needed, we'll send Blue," Wyman wrote. Glennon replied immediately, "Please send Blue as soon as possible."